My name is Juliet Grames. I was born in Hartford, Connecticut, to a family. My mother's a first-generation American. Her parents were from Molise and Calabria, and my dad is kind of a run-of-the-mill American white guy. So that's my last name. Doesn't look Italian, but I promise the heart is Italian. I grew up in the bosom of this very tight-knit Italian family in Hartford, Connecticut, in an immigrant community. My grandparents had come over in the 1930s, and a lot of their peers had come over in that same generation. And I was the oldest grandchild, and I definitely felt the joyful burden of being responsible for maintaining their culture and their heritage for my generation. Definitely, my mom was one of the oldest of her family as a first generation, and you can see what happens. Her oldest brother is fluent in Italian. My mom is fluent in Italian, but shy about speaking it because she thinks that she's not good enough. One more brother down and they can't speak Italian anymore, and all the younger kids totally lost that cultural connection. So among my cousins, I was the oldest and I had everything my mother worked to give me, but the younger cousins have always felt more of that stress of the diaspora. They don't know who they are. They don't know where they came from. They may or may not be able to name the towns that their grandparents were born in. And so I think even when I was a little kid, this fact about cultural identity and was I Italian? How did that fit into my American identity? It was something I thought about from the time I was a little teeny tiny girl. I loved going to my grandparents' house and seeing their gardens and seeing my aunt had a wine cellar and she had prosciutto and sopressad curing in her basement. And that was something that my friends at school, their parents and grandparents didn't have. I was proud of it. I was interested in it. So I started feeling Italian very young, and it made me really want to be a writer and to write about those immigrants, their amazing stories, but also more about the Italian American experience and who we are. And I had that idea when I was little. The first time I tried to write a novel about my grandmother, I was 8 years old, and it was called An Italian Girl, and it was 3 pages long. So, you do what you can. And then, from that point, 30 years passed. I grew up, I wrote, I threw away things that I wrote. I reconciled myself to the idea that writing was not a real career path because you can't make any money there. I went to college, and then I decided, I really love books. I love literature. I love to read. I still want to commit my life to literature, even though I can't be a writer myself because it's unrealistic to be a writer. So I became a book editor, and I've now been a book editor for 17 years. I work at an independent press in New York City called Soho Press, and I edit crime fiction novels there. I do a lot of international literature. I do literature and translation, but it's separate from my writing life, and I've been there now for 11 years. So then in 2014, I realized that although I was doing this editorial work and I thought my life should be complete because I was so lucky to have this perfect job, I also had realized that I was deeply unhappy. I had this nagging sense of not having fulfilled my true purpose. And the purpose was to circle back and write that Italian story, immigration story that had been haunting me since I was a little girl. So I did. And I started working on that in 2014. I took a leave of absence from my job and I went and I lived in the village my grandmother was born in, which is called Jevoli. It is near La Mezzadera in the province of Catanzaro. And I know you guys are all, a lot of you are Calabrese, so I wonder if any of you are from that area. If you are from that area and you are reading Stella Fortuna in Italian, I would love to hear your opinions on the dialect, because my Italian publisher actually changed all of the dialect usage from the American original that I gave them, and they made it into a dialect that they thought would be easier for Italian readers to understand. But we'll put a pin in that. We'll come back to that later. I have strong feelings about this. But so I started working on this novel in 2014. I took that leave of absence. I lived in Jeboli. It was winter time. Everything was kind of crusted over with ice. And I lived with total strangers who, my grandmother's second cousin, who had ended up living in the house that her mother had given up when she emigrated in the 1930s. And he was a retired postman, and his wife, and they took care of me, and they taught me all kinds of proverbs, and they drove me around all of the towns in Calabria, basically showing me what they thought was beautiful and tourist worthy. And then, of course, I was interested in those things, but I was also interested in other things that they were like, why do you want to go here? And I'm like, because this is where we came from. I have to see what we left behind. And I really threw myself with great passion into trying to finish this project, which is now available in Italian, which was my dream come true. I never thought that Italians would be interested in reading the Italian-American story. So what that experience in Yevoli taught me, and then having this gift of being published in Italian, it taught me a couple things. First was that Americans all yearn for knowledge of our cultural identity. Every American you meet, almost every American you ask, what are you? And they'll say, before they say I'm American, they'll say, well, my parents were Irish, or, my grandparents came over from Hungary and China, or whatever it is. We all have this twisted sense of double identity, that there was something we left behind before we became American. And of course, for Italians, this is a strong yearning. We're a more recent immigration group. A lot of us came over in the early 20th century or even later. So we have more direct contact with that heritage. But then I learned during my research, and tell me if you disagree here, but in Italy, there is a mirror yearning for the diaspora and for the people who were lost. And every paese that I went to and checked in with the town hall to get municipal records, to look for birth certificates or immigration records, everywhere I went, there were volumes and volumes of this preserved immigration interest information, as if someday these people would come back and they would reclaim their cultural heritage. They would become part of the family again. And I know lots of friends who have roots in other parts of the world who have never had an experience like this. I think this is unique to Italy. And I think it's because after the last 6 years of studying all of the immigration and diaspora literature that I can, the Italian history and the internal migration history, it's a pattern that repeats itself over and over. Italians are migrants now as much as they were 100 years ago. Where we have gone and ended up has changed and shifted. But right now, as I'm working on my second book, I'm not looking at Italian-American immigration. I'm looking at migration within Italy. And the themes are as poignant to me. There are still ghost towns in Calabria that were forcibly abandoned, because of lack of resources, lack of access. I don't need to tell any of you about this. You are living this world, but I feel this intense desire for Americans particularly to acknowledge their cultural matrimony, their heritage here, and to acknowledge the heritage of the Italian South. It is ignored, it is overlooked, it is not what Americans know about. They don't know that their families are not from Venice and Florence. They when they go back to the homeland, they want to go see the Colosseum in Rome, and they want to go look at the Uffizi Gallery. And those things are beautiful, and we can be proud of them as Italians, but we have so much to be proud of as Southerners. And that history is something I've just become obsessed with and want to help spread the word. So turning back to Italy and to, book talks I've had in other parts of Italy besides Calabria, I found that there's not as much awareness of our Southern cultural heritage and how important it is in the rest of Italy either. I hope you don't mind that I'm saying our, because I feel like part of this community now, even though I'm an American interloper. I want Italians to recognize how important Calabria is, that has been harvested and used to build the Italian state, the culture that has been diluted in Calabria in order to buoy up the rest of the economy and the state. This is us. We've given ourselves to culture, to what Italian culture is, and we deserve some credit for it. I'm sorry, that's my soapbox. I'll come back to that later too. I want to tell you first about the personal side of this story. So I'm going to show you a couple photos if you don't mind. We're going to start with, okay, I'm going to start here. Did I succeed in sharing? There we go. Okay. So that photo is 37 years old. That's me in the middle. You can see it's exactly the same. I just have a lot more hair now. And on the left, that is my grandmother. Her birth name was Antonia Rotundo, and she was born in Jevoli. And on the right is her sister, Concetta. And they raised me when I was a little girl while my parents were working. And I loved them to death. They were best friends, sisters. They were born a year apart. They emigrated together in their teens. They married a pair of best friends. They bought two houses that shared the same backyard. And my grandmother had way too many children, just way too many children. And my aunt was unlucky in fertility and she was not able to have children. So what ended up happening was they raised all of those kids in that one backyard together as two moms. And it ended up being the right number of moms for that many children. So for my mom and all of her brothers, they had they had two moms. My generation, we had two grandmas. Really loved these women. They were super cool. And here's a later picture of them. Oh, actually, let me show you an earlier picture. This was them the year after they emigrated in 1940. And this was taken in the G. Fox building, which was a department store in downtown Hartford, where a lot of Italian immigrants had actually worked building. They were very involved in the construction of downtown Hartford in Connecticut, where I was born. So those are my pretty ladies. Again, that's my grandmother on the left and my aunt on the right. I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, I was the oldest grandchild, and I definitely felt their love for the land they had been forced to leave behind. They told me all kinds of stories, folk tales. They would sing songs to me, not very tunefully. I wish either of them was a better singer so I could have reproduced some of their songs, but and proverbs and just lore, their idea of medical wisdom, things that they had learned in the villages just became a huge part of my childhood. Obviously, they imparted on me very deeply the notion that the evil eye is by far the most dangerous force in the world and various ways to protect myself from that. I grew up just surrounded by their love and their world that they built for me. When I was 5 years old, my grandmother experienced a cerebral trauma, and she had swelling in her brain that was going to be fatal. And she was rushed to the hospital in Hartford, where there was a really cutting edge neuroscience facility, and the doctors there gave her an experimental lobotomy. So if you have read the opening of Stella Fortuna, you will know that this is very similar to the setup that I present there. But my grandmother's life was saved. They removed a third of her frontal lobe of her brain, and they told us that she would never walk or talk again, that she would be a vegetable in a wheelchair for the rest of her life. And they were really wrong. So 6 weeks later, she was dancing at a wedding, and we actually have a photo of her putting lipstick on, and she's wearing a party dress, and you can see how recent the lobotomy is because her head is still shaved where they did the operation. So she had this miracle recovery that no one would have believed in. But after the lobotomy, she had been lobotomized. So her personality was drastically different. The brain is a very strange organ. No one knows exactly what's going to happen when you have this kind of invasive procedure. And in her case, it made her a completely different person. So after her lobotomy, she was very childlike and joyful. She was always smiling, or she was enraged. And there was nothing in between. Most of the time she was smiling and happy and childlike. The only time she would become enraged was when she was with her sister, who she hated and who she refused to ever speak to again for the rest of her life, which went on for another 30 years. So she lived to be almost 100 years old, never spoke to her sister again. This is the sister who shares the house next door, who raised her children for her, who would cook for her because she couldn't cook for herself. It was just, and for my aunt, who had not had a lobotomy, this was the ultimate heartbreak. She had lost the best friend of her life. her constant companion. They both outlived their husbands by a long time, and these two women were forced to sit alone in neighboring houses, and they could never be together. They could never get together at sunset and gossip and watch TV together like they had their entire lives. It was just, the family was broken in half, because even my grandmother refused even to celebrate holidays with my aunt. If my aunt were in the same room as her, she would attack her physically, because, you know, when you take out the frontal lobe, you remove all the inhibitions. So this was a family trauma that happened when I was 5 years old. It was exactly that moment I was telling you about before that I realized how obsessed I was with our Italian identity and the immigrant story and what my grandmother had been through. I was just starting to understand the things she was telling me when she stopped telling those stories because of what happened with her brain. So I think you can say that probably that accident is the reason that my grandmother became the obsession of my life, and why I kept turning and turning on this to try to figure out who she was before she lost her agency, to try to figure out why this thing had happened, to figure out why she was so angry at her sister who had been her best friend for all of these years. That was the personal side of this story. And then, you know, the more general side was I wanted so much to understand their immigration experience and how it had changed them. And of course, the more research I did on this topic, the more I learned about the blanks that needed to be filled in there. And my aunt was, as I mentioned, left completely alone by her sister now. She had lost her best friend. She had lost her social connections because they couldn't be together anymore. And she gave me everything. She spent hundreds and hundreds of hours with me, doing oral history interviews, teaching me how recipes that she had learned from her mother and learned here to help describe her process of becoming an American. She couldn't read or write, as were many of the women who I interviewed for this book, could not read or write, but they did maintain this cultural literacy of recipes that they had preserved from their mothers. And in a way, that form of literacy also can transmit some very ancient history that we don't get in books written about Calabria. By the way, there are just not enough books written about Calabria's history, especially, I think, Calabria's women of this pre-literacy era. There wasn't enough for me to tap into. I dug deep. You know, at college, I was a history major. I can read in Italian. I look all the time. I'm still reading. But what I learned from women who let me interview them was much more helpful and illustrating, sometimes unbelievable, and sometimes really eye-opening. So my aunt introduced me to a whole bunch of women from her peer group and slightly younger women who had emigrated in the 20s, 30s, and you know, there was really no immigration in the 40s or until the late 50s, but and then in the 50s, or who were born first generation Americans who could help me understand that experience. She introduced me to a bunch of people in Yevoli who she hadn't seen in 70 years, but she still knew their names, and so I was able to talk to them when I went to Yevoli. And through the pieces of collecting all of these interviews, I committed to making a novel that would be not just about my grandmother and her very strange life story, but it could be more generally an homage to my grandmother and to my aunt and to the other women of that generation whose stories are so often buried and not told. And I wanted to write about them. So this ended up becoming a novel. Stella Fortuna is a completely fictitious character. I couldn't write about my grandmother because I couldn't understand her personality. After the lobotomy, she was a cipher. But I could write about these women more generally, and I borrowed pieces from their life experiences that they shared so generously with me. I tried so hard to capture the themes that I heard again and again in their stories. And I didn't do this on purpose. I was trying to be true to their experience. But in the end, when I was making the final edit of this book and deciding what to include because it was too long, I realized that I was focusing on things that I hadn't read in other books about the Italian American experience. I was trying to tell their story as it had been buried and obfuscated. And so that's another thing that I came to realize as I was doing this research. The Italian American story for the last 100 years has been really fraught as it exists in literature because we have a very troubled history of our own image as Italian Americans. I'm going to go back and give a little short history talk that you all may know or may have encountered already in this course, but the Italian American immigration story really doesn't start in a big way until the very end of the 19th century. There were Italians who had come over before, middle class or upper class Italians who had come here with different business ventures. But really, the mass migration that started at the turn of the 19th century coincided in the United States with the abolition of slavery here of African Americans. And there was this gap where you had completely unpaid, uncompensated labor force of the African American slaves that was lost. And then suddenly you have, after the Risorgimento and the Italians trying to flee to the United States for opportunity, you have a whole population of Italians, many of whom have no access to resources, many of whom are not literate or able to protect themselves. They don't have friends here. They are very easily preyed upon for very low wages. And there is definitely in the 1890s and 1900s a lost generation of men who arrived here who were never heard from again, who disappeared into the mines, or who got embroiled in other problems that allowed them, they were lost to their families. And this is something that is really haunting me now. It's not my family story. My family came over later in the 1930s. But I've been reading a lot about this time, this lost generation lately, because I wanted to understand the origin of this idea that Italian Americans are all criminals. And that had been really codified by 1910, 1911. A study was done by the Boston Globe where they were examining Italian criminality, especially the criminal mind of the Italian South. And they put together a panel of criminologist experts, both Italian and Italian American, to determine, is the Southern Italian, in fact, more violent and more liable to criminal behavior than other immigrant groups? And the answer they came up with was, yes, they are. They're stabby. They have their stilettos, they have their grudges and their vendettas, and they get very impassioned and they can't control their sexual rages, and then they kill each other, and it's a big problem. Okay, this was scientifically arrived at. It's the era of phrenology, so people have a lot of pseudoscience that they're relying on. This study definitely set the tone for the next 100 years of Italian American cultural representation and literature, because we have been working to undermine that idea and to replace it with a more holistic representation of our culture. But it did more than that. It extends beyond Italian Americans. It actually changed the course of United States immigration policy. So in 1921, the U.S. federal government actually ended up using the science in this study to reform what their immigration policies, and to issue the Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1924 that ended up instituting a quota on anyone who was going to come into the United States. So before that, if you had a promise of a visa and work, you could come in. Suddenly in 1924, that door slams closed, and it's entirely ethnically designated. So Italians are a chief target of this. The quota for Italians is really small. The quota for more desirable immigrants, like people from England or Scandinavia or Northern Europe, the good immigrants, was not capped in the same way. And of course, worst of all, the racial ramifications here were that for non-white immigrants, immigration was capped almost entirely. So Asians were completely excluded. And that's a different story. But basically, it's the reason that Italian immigration is so closely connected in our history to ongoing immigration racism in all other groups in the United States. And it's a reason it's so crucial for Italian Americans to understand, A, where we came from, and B, what our part in this continuum is. Many, many Italian Americans now, third and fourth generation Italians, vote consistently for the right-wing platform against immigration. And I'm not going to talk about politics today because I don't want to do that. That's not what we're here for. But I do want to say that for immigration, we need to do soul searching on this matter. Because if I imagine my great grandmother, Assunta, who couldn't read or write, and who arrives here with a questionable visa. In fact, and her husband at that time was a convicted murderer. Okay, so and she arrives with her 9-year-old son who has also no access to English, no literacy, and if they had been detained in New York Harbor and locked up in separate jails, and had to figure out on their own how to get into this country, which is what is being asked of Mexican children at our borders right now. I can't. I mean, it horrifies me to think about. I want every Italian American to be thinking about their great grandmother Assunta and what would have happened if she had been locked up in jail and separated from her 9-year-old son. That's what I want every Italian to be thinking about. So anyway, back to the story of literature and the Italian American identity. For the last 100 years, Italian American scholars and writers have been fighting against this awful impression of what Italians are. Obviously, I don't need to tell you that quote unquote science from 1911 is total bogus. I mean, it's not fair to anyone. It's especially not fair because when you're looking at any fringe group, so any group of immigrants who's arriving here out of desperation, of course there's criminality. There are criminals preying on those immigrants, as well as criminality within that group. There are people fleeing desperate things they were forced to do in the lands that they came from. There are unattractive parts of the immigrant story, okay? For the last 100 years, we have been trying to suppress those unattractive elements of our story because we're afraid of them and the damage that it can do to us. So I want to put forth that after 100 years, Italians are now well enough established and respected in the United States that it's time for us to look at those stories again and stop burying the stories of people like my grandmother and what they went through, that they were so difficult. Life in Yevoli was difficult. They were starving. They had much hardship before they left. They didn't want to leave. They loved Calabria. They were forced to leave, and in the act of leaving, they had to get on a boat to go to a place they didn't know, to speak a language they had never heard before. They couldn't read or write. The odds that they overcame are incredible to think about. I've never done anything with all of my resources and tools. I've never done anything that brave. So I actually want to make the argument that if we can be more honest about those harsher aspects of the immigrant story, we are in fact restoring the heroism of our grandmothers and our grandfathers, what they actually went through, what they actually fought for. We don't need to bury this story. We can own it. We can be proud of it. We can be proud that they were illiterate because they gave something to us so that we can write books. We can write their stories down. We can be proud of their poverty because they overcame it and they worked so hard to give us what we have. And furthermore, if we can acknowledge the darkness in our own past, not only do we understand ourselves better, but we connect better to all of the other immigrant groups right now that are struggling. And we are more politically connected to their issues and to understanding their experience. And we're just better people who are better connected to this modern world of globalization, potential opportunity, entrenched poverty, rising feudalism. We can be part of what's corrective here instead of part of the problem. And that's what I wanted to do with Stella. I wanted to tell a story that was true and that examined stories that had been buried elsewhere. And I will say that there was some pushback from the Italian American community. I wrote to one Italian American journal to ask them if I could have my publicist send them a review copy. And the editor wrote back to me right away and said, "We will not cover your book if there's any mention of organized crime in it." And I was able to say, well, there isn't. So unless you're really reading between the lines when it's there for you. But so then they reviewed my book. But I thought that was interesting. They would not even entertain any story that covered that. There's organized crime in every immigrant community. This is a fact. It's not just Italian. So I thought, okay. I also, experienced, I do a lot of book talks, and when I do them for a more general audience, I get one set of questions. When I do them for a more Italian American audience, I get a different set of questions, sometimes which include, my family was very loving. I'm really sorry that you had this negative experience in your family. Did you set out to make all Calabrese men look evil? And so that's a conversation that I really relish having, because I think, first of all, I didn't create a story about my family. This is fiction. It's fiction that draws very heavily on my historical background and my belief that we really need to have a lot of integrity as we approach our sources. I heard these stories from many, many people. There was no beat of emotional trauma in this story that I did not hear from multiple women who were generous enough to trust me with their stories. And that meant if they were trusting me with those stories, they wanted someone to listen to them. So I thought that was really fascinating. I also thought it was fascinating to look at characters to say that the men in this book are all evil. I did not set out to create evil men in this. I set out to create men who functioned realistically within the patterns of the plot and their time and their place. And I think that I don't want to spoil the book for anyone who hasn't read this already, but in particular, I think not all of the men in the book can be judged by our modern mindset. You have to look at what it would have been like during this time and the pressures on the men as well as on the women in their lives. This is, my saw against the patriarchy here is that it doesn't just hurt and enslave women, it hurts and enslaves men too. It asks them to live with a domestic partner who they don't see as a partner or as a friend. It's, there's all kinds of problems that got gradually worked out. Over the last 60 years, we've been working so hard to improve the condition for women all over the world, in Italy, in the United States, and elsewhere. So I really wanted to capture the truth of that story. It's part of the reason that I had a modern first-person narrator who could reflect on some of these issues, because, Stella herself wasn't angry enough for me about the things that happened to her, because for her, they were expected. And for me, I wanted the modern reader to have to think about how awesome it is that things are changing and that there is hope for change. So that's a little bit about the background of my story, my desire to write an immigration story, to write a story about the Italian South, to vindicate us as Southerners, and also to be willing to tell the truth about what our experience is, because I think in our hardship, we also find our heroism and we find what we should be proud of. We should be proud of to have given the rest of the world, which is happy to harvest our labor and our resources and our intellects. And yeah, they should be so grateful for it. I'll stop talking now, but I'll just conclude with one more photo because I really wanted to show it. So yeah, there they are. Those are my ladies. That's my grandmother and my aunt, and they inspired this book. And yeah, I'm going to open up for questions now because I want to hear from you.
Okay, yes. For the students, Michaela first. Okay, go ahead, Michaela.
Well, have your students, please just let them go.
They need a few minutes.
Guys. Okay. Yeah. So thank you so much, Juliet. That was beautiful. I have to tell you. By the way, I'm a professor of Italian American literature. I have a PhD in Italian American, John Fund. But mostly right now I'm researching on in the literary representation of gender violence within the Italian American communities, the early Italian American communities at Birkbeck University, London. And your book will be one of the few books I will be focusing on. The other will be Onto the Daughters by Karen Tintori, Behind Open Doors of Maria Messina, and the last one will be mine, which is Rosa. This is the book that I wrote. It is a memoir book about the story of my family, because we have very similar stories. My family moved to America in 1907. They moved to New York and then Connecticut, and they lived in Connecticut. Then eventually there they had a weird life, terrible life, very difficult life. Above all, Rosa, that is my great grandmother. And the story of my great grandmother had always been there in my family. So I'd always known that I had a person in my family far related to me that went to America and had an incredible life. Yeah. But the details of whatever happened to her, that it was terrible and harsh, were revealed to me when my grandma, a few years ago in Italy, got very sick, and she was aided by a Moldavian lady. And so I volunteered to teach Italian to the Moldavian lady. And while I was teaching Italian to her, my grandma, in her bed, in the final days of her life, told me the very terrible details of the story that Rosa had to go through. It was like giving me a sort of burden. Like I was the first person in my family who had the chance to get an education. Yeah. I was the first Valmori who could go to university, who could get a PhD. So I was kind of given the sort of burden. You have to tell the story.
Yeah.
Tell the story. Do you know what I had to do? I had to go to the United States.
Yeah.
So 3 years ago, I was lucky enough. I was, that was a honor to me. I got a Fulbright scholarship and I went to Notre Dame, the University of Notre Dame, and I taught Italian American culture there. And while I was there, I could write down the story of my family, the memoir of my family that was always there, that I always felt I wanted to tell.
Michela, sorry, Michela, just it's all very interesting, but
I will definitely go. I just have one detail. Can I? Sorry about that.
Yeah.
I will, just to let you know that I will write you an email because I'd like to ask you. Yeah, definitely. We need to share the story of patriarchy. I would like to ask you a lot of questions, and so thank you very much. Just that's also interesting. I'm very excited, and thank you so much for telling us about your story. Thank you. Sorry, Margherita, about that.
No, I wanted to. Yeah,
Michela, and anyone else who wants to email me, my email is really easy. It's just my name, juliet.grames@gmail.com. And I would love to keep in touch with anyone here who wants to. I do hope to get to Calabria someday really soon. So I'd love to make that connection, please.
Sure.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, we can start with the questions from the students. Daniela first.
Yes, here I am. It's a pleasure to meet you. I'm sorry, but my video camera isn't working well, so I hope you can hear me.
Yeah.
Okay, nice. Stella Fortuna's story is about women, but also about the Italian diaspora abroad. And it is a very deep text. And I would like to know, what emotions did you feel when you wrote this book?
Oh, wow. What a great question. The emotion, well, first it started with obsession and desperation, right? I think if we have a lot of writers in the room, about that, like obsession and desperation, and that horrible, awful feeling when you're not telling the story, it feels really bad. But then when you're writing some of this material, it made me so angry and it made me so heartbroken. I think especially for me in literature, what always hits me the hardest is the idea of a door closed and a relationship that can never be redeemed. It's when it's too late. And I saw that in the story of Stella. There is no way to fix what was bad that happened to her. There's no help for her. And it became a kind of reflection on the immigrant experience where you don't know that the door is closing. You don't know that you're leaving forever, that you're never going to see your home again. But in many ways, you can never redeem that connection to the place of your birth. And in fact, even if you do go back later, like the character of Carmelo tries to go back again and again to his hometown, but it's not the same as the place you leave behind, and so that notion of the doors in our lives closing and shutting us off from the people who we should be able to connect with as a metaphor for immigration. And it really haunted me. It became a really deeply emotional experience. And I have to say, this book was really hard to write emotionally, and I had to save myself by trying to introduce moments of humor and whimsy, because there's so much of that in my family. The storytelling is mostly funny, outrageous, and so that really got me through, and I hope that it helps get the reader through as well. This is tough material. It is tough material, and I acknowledge that. And I also was very emotionally fatigued when I got to the end of this book. And I kept wanting to engage with the Calabrese experience and Calabrese history. And I knew the next book I wanted to write was also about Calabria, but I found I needed to hit a really different emotional note. I needed something fun, adventure, romantic. So I'm now in the midst of a writing experience about Calabria that's completely different than the first one. So thank you for asking that question.
Yeah, thank you. And you don't want to tell us anything about the new book? Maybe later, okay?
I would love to. I'll whenever you're ready.
Okay, let's go to the next questions from Marielle. Marielle?
Yes.
Yeah.
Hope you see me. Okay, so I want to say hi to all of our guests and thank you, Juliet, because your story is extraordinary at many levels. It's a beautiful story, so thank you for sharing with us. So my question is about your research, because I wanted to ask you if there's something you expected to find with your research, but you ended up not finding, or if there was something you found that you never expected of.
It was all the other way around. There was never anything that I was looking for that I didn't find, unless I was looking for something that led me on a whole other, chase down. I learned so much. I didn't know exactly what was going to happen in the plot of the book until I started in the research, because I knew I wanted the story arc to kind of follow my grandmother's life. She had 8 near-death experiences, but all of the blanks in between, I just knew I had to get her from point A to point B, and I had to figure out historically realistic reasons that would happen. And it was just incredible. It was, things are unbelievable. There's a lot of kind of fabulism that comes out, especially when you're talking to anziane. They have these stories that just sound too big or too extreme to be true. And I think for that reason, maybe a lot of people don't take their stories seriously. And then when you dig deeper, you find that not only were they telling the truth, but sometimes the truth is even more bizarre. And so it went on. And I think there was so much to research that it's ended up growing into a whole other book. But so I started with this. This was just a notebook. It's now, you can see how well worn. These were just questions I was asking myself as I was trying to think about the plot, and all of the angles where it led me. And I carried this book around for about 4 years, and I mentioned I did do a lot of book reading. I read everything I could about Calabria in English, which is like 4 books. I read about the female Southern Italian experience wherever I could find it. So I widened my purview there. I read a lot about Basilicata and Puglia and just the south of Italy in general, where I could find, and Sicily, of course, books like Maria Messina, anything like that, anything I could find by female authors, by their expat writers who wrote about the South, and they're all kind of, everyone from like Norman Douglas and Edward Lear and Anne Cornelison was a huge help to me. But those people, they're all angry and they all look down on the South that they're writing about, not exactly as human, but more like a kind of zoo experiment. So I became even more focused on wanting to write my own kind of own voices, depiction of the Southern experience. I relied heavily on recipes, as I said. I used recipes, actually, the excuse of collecting recipes as a way to interview those older women. Because if you've ever tried to interview an older woman, especially in that like generation in their upper 80s or 90s, you sit down and you're like, oh, I want to talk about my life, your life. And they'll be like, oh, my life, it's not interesting. I have nothing to say, like that. So you have to, and I think a lot of them humbly do believe that they're not interesting. And the way that you can get them to open up is to put them on grounds they're really confident or confrontational about, which is like, this cookie recipe. And why would you put cinnamon in this cookie recipe when Aunt Doll only uses cardamom? And then, you start from that point of conflict, and then they'll have more confidence and they open up. So I used cooking as a way to get into a lot of basement kitchens and do a lot of talking about ways that women remembered their mothers and their aunts, ways they remembered their immigration experience and encountering what American cuisine was, ways they remembered harvesting in the 1920s, the food that they would end up using in these recipes, it became a huge jumping off point for me. I mentioned that I stayed with that Postino and his wife, and they loved proverbs. And I didn't know before I got to Calabria how famous the Calabresi are for their proverbs. So once we figured out that that was a really fun icebreaker, we started collecting them. So every time we would drive to a new house and meet a new person, Luigi would be like, so what proverbs do you know? She really likes proverbs. And we'd sit down, we write, and they'd argue about them, though. This is the correct wording. This is the correct interpretation. So I did use about, I don't know, 12 or 13 of them in the book, but I got to collect a whole bunch of them. And then there is, for me, a subtext that I couldn't use in the text at all, but music was so important. Encountering folk music from this period and hearing the sound of like what my grandmother would have heard growing up as I was writing, it helped me live in what for me was the mood of her experience in Jevoli. And it so for me, it's always running in the background. There's like a song that is equated with each of the chapters that I played for myself. And it ended up being, researching music ended up being a jumping off point for the second book that I'm working on now. Really, really important. Let's see, what else did I leave out? Those are the big ones. I think everyone goes to text first, obviously interviews, but for me, the recipes, the proverbs, and the music were so important.
Thank you. This was especially important for us because we are all trying to write papers of storytelling or families, friend stories about migration. So this is really, really interesting. So thank you.
You did ask, I didn't answer part of your question, was what did I find that surprised me?
If you found something that you never expect finding.
Absolutely. There were a lot of those. So I'm just going to be very innocent and tell you one, which was the first time I went to the municipio in Feroleto Antico, which is it's now where the comune is, because Jevoli is just frazione. And I asked for the records it was just at the very beginning of my time in Jevoli, so I didn't even quite know where the story was going to go yet. And the officer there was so helpful, and she just found reams and reams of family tree records and marriage certificates and property certificates, and she showed all of them to me, a big binder of visas. But she also showed me this. So that is, you see the X through it? Yes. That is my great-grandfather's canceled birth certificate. And then she pulled out the not canceled birth certificate from several years later. And that was how I found out that my great-grandfather had been born a bastard, and that this birth certificate was canceled when he was legally adopted by his biological father. And I have to tell you that the number of his children my great-grandfather had told that he was a bastard was 0. They had no idea. And also finding this record unlocked a whole other series of records that I hadn't known to look into about who his biological mother was and what had happened in his childhood, to have him reassigned and have his identity changed this way. It was really, really creepy. It was a creepy revelation. And I learned so much from it, and it opened up so many other angles of inquiry. It seems pretty innocent. The other one that I actually just represent in the book because it was so creepy to me was that my grandmother, after her lobotomy, she woke up from her coma and insisted that her birthday was January 11th. And it had, of course, been January 12th her entire life before then. And her sister even said, no, she was born on January 12th. She's confused. You know, she has brain damage. And when I went to Feroleto and I found her birth certificate, I found that she was born on January 11th. So it was a secret that she had been hiding for 70 years, that her own sister didn't know. And then trying to find the reason why she had changed her birth, because, you know, we all have everyone in this group, I would bet money, has a grandparent whose birthday is not what it says on their birth certificate. But in the case of my grandmother, why had she been hiding it for all of those years, and why did her own sister not know? And there did end up being a story there, and it was so weird I had to use it in the book. But yeah, the hairs on my arm rose when I found that, because it meant I had to ask myself, what other things had my grandmother said that we assumed were crazy that were not actually crazy? That it was her telling the truth that everyone else had forgotten.
Thank you again. Everything you say is just mesmerizing, let me say. So thank you again. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Okay, Paola. Paola.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Can you see me?
Yes. Yes.
So I just want to thank you for being here, because it's a pleasure. My question is just it's personal question, because your story is very interesting. So knowing that Stella Fortuna is inspired to your grandmother, I just want to ask you if I can, what is the relationship between you and your grandmother?
Oh my God. We were so close. And I was close to both my grandmother and her sister until they both died. And you know, you had to spend time with them separately. They could never be in the same room for most of my life. But my grandmother had this, the last 30 years of her life were kind of a twilight, where she was very childlike, and she, you know, she enjoyed telling stories about what she had seen on TV and stuff like that, but it was very hard to have to know her as a real person, you know. But sometimes things would come out, and I feel like even in those 30 years where she wasn't herself, she wasn't a full human, she still gave us, she gave me personally glimpses into who she had been before that. I never could get, you know, reach her. I couldn't reach her. She was blocked from me. So that was something that always haunted me as well. But meanwhile, my aunt was my best friend. I talked to her every day on the phone. Even when I moved to New York City for college, and then I lived there for 20 years, and I still talk to her every day on the phone. And she would make me care packages. I would come and visit her once a month. I would spend, you know, a week at a time on summer, during the summer or at Christmas, living in her guest bedroom, and she would teach me how to cook stuff or drag me to church with her old bingo friends and things like that. So we were very, very close. And through her, I tried to access my grandmother as well. But they were the best. They were big parts of my life. They both died. They died 6 months apart, and my grandmother died after I had sold my book for publication, but 6 months before it came out. And then my aunt ended up dying just a few days before it came out. She got to see a finished copy. And, you know, I have a very melodramatic family. So of course they have an open casket wake, and they put a copy of the book in her casket. And I was like, guys, this is over the top. Like, this is not okay. And they were like, she would have wanted it this way. I was like, you know, it's her book as much as mine. I dedicated it to her because she really breathed life into it for me, and gave me so much of her time and attention. So
thank you to share with us this private thing. Thank you.
No. Listen, you can ask me any question. I'm not afraid of any question. If I don't want to answer it, I'll say I'm not going to answer it.
Thank you very much.
So thank you. Yes, while we wait for more questions from the students, Juliet, Anna Clara, who was connected in this team but had to leave first, she teaches at Loyola University, and she's with us in this team very often. She texted me if I could ask you 2 questions from her. So yeah. I'm going to read the questions, so she will listen to the recording after. Okay. So she's saying, in your opinion, how much of the Italian heritage was lost because of the fading away of the language or dialect? This is the first question. The second is, beside your closeness to your grandma and aunt, what triggered your desire to belong to the Italian or Calabrese culture?
So first on the matter of dialect, I love linguistics. I'm fascinated by it. I love studying languages. Studying dialect is, of course, this elusive thing where it's so hard to pin it down. It's often not written. And, you know, as a very kind of spoiled ivory tower trained historian, you learn everything through reading and writing, right? And the idea that you have to learn things orally is hard. But I am an apologist for dialect, and I'm very, very frustrated by actually the term dialect. I want to go ahead and just state the fact that Calabrese is in fact a suite of languages, not dialects, that they are powerful and have deep, rich history that reflects our multiculturalism and the influences of so many different groups of people who have tried to conquer us and failed, but left this impression of what we wanted to take from their culture. I love the Calabrese languages, and it was really fascinating. So if you're reading my my English version, I didn't want to put too much Calabrese in there because I knew the American reader, it was going to be a barrier for them, you know, an access barrier. So I tried to only use words that they could absorb from context. Nevertheless, I checked all of those things. I had a local, a woman who was born in Yevoli, a native speaker of Yevolaru, and she is a lawyer. And I checked everything by her, and then I also checked one by a publishing specialist from Catanzaro. And it's funny because even those are 20 kilometers apart, but even so, they had dialectic differences. And I was so careful. I wanted an exact representation. I wanted this to sound like my grandmother sounds in my ear, because, you know, that voice is lost forever now. But then when it was published by HarperCollins Italia in Milano, they had to rewrite the Calabrese dialect so it would be something that more Italian readers would understand. Eventually they gave me the rough draft, and it was like, this sounds like a speaker from Reggio. We don't talk like this at all. You don't have these words. So then we met somewhere in the middle. But I just think that dialects capture so much history and culture, those layers of ethnic influence. And on top of that, it's so much of the sense of humor of a place comes out in the personality of the dialect, and you're missing so much of that sense of humor if you miss that personality, the wordplay, and the way our ideas kind of echo in our word choice. So I think dialect is really, really important. I'm currently very deeply engaged in the history of Greco or Grecanico. And because I'm writing about, right now I'm writing about the Aspromonte and about the history of, I'm very interested in the history of minority languages. And Greco is kind of extreme, right? Because it's not an Italian language, but, you know, Calabrese is also a language that's a minority language. It should be respected in the same way, I think. So this is something I think a lot about. And you know, Calabria has so many other interesting minority languages as well. They're all really fascinating to deal with.
Yeah.
So.
Thank you. This is so great. And okay, let's go ahead with the questions because, you know, time is running fast. Okay, Danilo. Okay, oh, Giada, sorry, Giada.
Okay. Hi, Juliet. It's a pleasure to meet you. My question for you is, the ironic tone used in the novel, is it a form of resilience to survive all those violence that Stella Fortuna suffered?
Yeah, I mean, I thought that was I needed to tackle this with irony, because I do think there's something about, you know, survival at all costs, which is really interesting to me, and the notion of stubbornness, the stubborn will to live, and just to not give up, even when it would be so much easier to do, the idea of giving up control or giving up your personal safety is so creepy to me. It's the scariest thing to me. And I think that the idea that Stella wants to keep control over herself and to fight back and to stay alive no matter what. It's something I really identified with, and I thought about a lot when I thought about the fact that my grandmother had survived 8 near-death experiences. I was like, wouldn't someone else have gotten tired at a certain point? But she didn't, and I love that stubborn will to live. As for the irony, yeah, for me, I needed the irony for a sense of humor about telling some of the darker material in it, but also because I don't know, I think that's just natural to me. I love looking at the past with a slight sense of humor, and I think especially looking at a lot of the tough women in our past. They have this amazing sense of humor that gets them through the tight spots. When they don't have control over anything else. You know, they don't have the right to run their families or to make choices for themselves, but they do have a right to their sense of humor and irony. So that is really important to me.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Lucia?
Hi, nice to meet you. Can you see me?
Yes, hi.
So I'm from Angoli, near Jevoli, and wanted to ask you if you came to my village as well in order to find some information and to interview people and so on.
I did. Angoli, now you're part of the comune is Stella, right?
Yes.
Yeah, yeah. So I didn't. I did. I visited Angoli. I visited Serra. I did not go into the archives there, but I did spend. You know, I spent more than a month in Jevoli and all of the surrounding frazioni. So you know well that like Tracci doesn't exist, right? But I did want Tracci to seem like it could exist. So I visited all of the tiny frazioni to try to create Tracci and create a real feeling place. It's interesting because I see your last name is Scalise. I have Scalise in my family. So we have recently connected. My mother and I have connected with a man from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, who is, his family is from Angoli. And he found us because he's on one of those genes, the 23andMe, you know, genes sourcing ancestry website. And he found that he's our second cousin. So now I know the next time I go to Calabria, I have to go to Angoli because I have family there and probably had origins there. So.
Oh, so I hope to see you if you come here.
I promised a lot of people that the first place I'm going to go when they let me get on a plane is to Calabria. So.
Thank you.
We'll be waiting for you also in France. Thank you. So Danilo. Danilo, if you want, you can speak.
Hi, Mer.
Puoi parlare?
No, vorrei provare a parlare in inglese, che mi sono preparato una cosina. Giusto. Ci provo, ci provo. Good evening. Okay. You speak very fast. Impressive.
Yeah, sorry, I do.
No. I'm happy to meet you. I like your smile very. I introduce myself. I'm Danilo. I live in Cosenza, city of Calabria. I'm a student of the fantastic Professor Ganeri. I don't speak English very well, but I try. I don't know if you have seen Muccino's short film on Calabria, but I would like to inform that today there are no boys with flat caps. I don't just eat soppressata. I want to ask you, what do you like about this beautiful, rich, and poor Calabria? Would you live in this region?
Yeah, totally. I am, and this kind of gets to the question that Professor Ganeri asked me that I hadn't answered yet, about, you know, what is my relationship to Calabria and why am I drawn to it? And I think part of this is, you know, not genetic maybe, but epigenetic. I feel like Calabria, I have no right to call Calabria home, but I feel this longing to connect there. And I was so close, maybe it's because I was so close to my grandmother that the place where she was from, it's just so embedded in my heart. And I long for it, you know, and when I go, yes, would I live there? I would love to live in Calabria. It would be amazing. I have thought about it often. I have an entrenched life here. You know, I have a vegetable garden that someone has to keep growing. So, and I have a baby who needs to go to school and things like that. So logistically, it's complicated, but I have that yearning. And I definitely, over the last 6 years, since I first went to Calabria in 2014, have been there many times. I cannot tell you how many because it's an embarrassing number, but I'm always drawn back. What do I love about Calabria? I do love the beauty. I love the food. I love the culture. I love, like many Americans, I love seeing old things because we don't have old things here. So that's, you know, amazing. The natural beauty is incredible. I am also a little bit of a tragedist, I guess, and I love Calabria because I feel like other people don't love it enough. And I feel like this is my job to give back what other people are missing. And I'm so obsessed with the history and how it is misunderstood or misrepresented, or how sometimes it even contradicts itself. You know, you hear two things that are both true and they are directly in conflict with each other. And I'm fascinated by our double identity. I do feel that for the Calabrese identity requires cognitive dissonance. You have to be able to live in two incompatible realities at all time. So, you know, you have to know that Calabria is the beautiful homeland and that it's all, you know, wealth and resources and a beautiful culture, and that the people there are good and generous, and they, you know, they love one another, and they fight fiercely to protect one another. You can know all these things, and you can also know that it is the home of the Ndrangheta, and that there are people who don't protect each other, that they prey on one another, and that there are villages that have been emptied out because they are so poor and neglected that they have fallen victims for an organized criminal syndicate and or a state that completely ignores them and preys upon them. These are all true, all at the same time. And I just, no matter how much I study, I can't get to the bottom of that, because for me, the two incompatible realities are hard. You know, Americans are not used to that. We are used to always seeing things only from our one point of view. And so for me, it's addictive to try to be back in these multiple realities and to understand them more, just to research more and more and more.
Thank you, Mrs. Juliet.
This is great. Juliet, you're very passionate. This is fantastic.
That's true.
Okay, so we have only 15 minutes left. I would like to give to hear Sam and Steve for listening a few anticipation of your new novel to conclude. Okay, so
go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, Sam.
Yes. Oh, Sam, why don't you go first? Oh, okay, I'll go first. First of all, as a matter of highest praise, your enthusiasm is really overflowing with enthusiasm. And, that's really a nice thing to see. This is a question that really haunts me about Italian American literature in general. I think that we have seen texts from other ethnic groups like Angela's Ashes, The Namesake, The Woman Warrior become very successful, but that doesn't seem to be the case with Italian American literature. And as an editor, as a writer, do you have any insights on that? It's kind of shocking to me. I read, well, there's a lot of talk about Christ in Concrete and how it, butted heads, with The Grapes of Wrath, but it didn't get that same, play as The Grapes of Wrath.
Yeah, actually, that's a fantastic question. I worked in publishing all this time. I was routinely told that Italians don't read. Right, so the choice of this book, and I have a little bit of an identity crisis as a writer, because I love to read literary fiction, and I wanted to write something difficult and thought-provoking. I didn't want to write formula commercial fiction. I didn't want to, be bound into a happy ending or anything like that. And I mean, you can see that when they made the American paperback, and actually the Italian paperback is going to use this cover too, they put this very kind of lush and soft and safe feeling cover on it, right? I feel bad for the person who picks this up and thinks it's going to be a heartwarming story about sisters, but that was the thought when I'm very lucky. My publication was very they really rolled out the red carpet for me. I had a really good publishing deal, and they kicked butt with it, and they sold a lot of copies, but they have positioned it as a commercial novel, and I think it's because the idea was that Italians are not serious literary readers. If we are going to do a serious Italian literary novel, then it's going to be a very small book. It's, it will, and there's no room for why do we have that? I don't know. Because you mentioned The Namesake or Angela's Ashes. I mean, The Namesake, that Jhumpa Lahiri won the Pulitzer, right? She's a literary writer. I read and love her books. I am not Bengali, I love her even though I'm not Bengali. Why should an Italian American experience book only appeal to Italian readers, and why would we have to dumb it down for them? This is a good conversation, and we should continue talking about that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to take a lot of time. The thing that I don't understand is all these stories, and I've been involved in this field for a long time. It's about the human condition, and so whether the story is Italian or Bengalese or whatever, it's simply about the Italian or the human condition, just like your novel. Okay, good conversation.
Thank you, Steve.
Juliet, first of all, thank you so much for coming today. It's just blown. I'm trying to fight back tears as well as just trying to take notes as quickly as I possibly can. You can't do both at the same time. So my question for you, and this is something that possibly we can talk about later. I got a $200,000 grant from 7,000 Languages to create an online Calabrese course.
Oh, awesome.
Which shows my ignorance automatically, because as I went back to my village, which is Migliarina, which is not too far from you.
Yeah.
And 2 miles away, Amato, their dialect and ours only has about 80% overlap.
Yeah.
So as I'm talking to my students throughout the last 2 semesters, the question is, they keep asking me, well, which Calabrese dialect are you going to offer? So that's the conundrum that we're facing right now. It's a colleague of mine from Australia. She comes from the province of Reggio. I come from the province of Catanzaro. Okay. So how do we find kind of like, this is the problem that I'm going to ask you later, but how do we find some kind of generic Calabrese that can, that people can study, and then we can have like variants within our online course? But we can't just have San Patrese, which is my other village, and call it Calabrese. We have to have some kind of, some kind of neutral Calabrese, if there is something that we can offer that would attract as many Diaspora Calabrese around the world.
I have so many thoughts about this. I mean, literally, what I went through with my Italian publisher has forced me down some of these paths. I'd love to connect with you offline and talk about some ideas. Is the goal to teach people to speak Calabrese or only to understand?
It's to do both. Actually, what we're going to do is, instead of having the typical type of Rosetta Stone and Duolingo type of thing, we want to teach with video. So we want to teach with thematic video, Calabrese playing cards, Calabrese doing a rosary, making or showing their olive orchard, making soppressata, all those kinds of things, and then design language lessons around those videos. But the videos have to be the critical thing, with subtitles that we can have in Spanish, because we all have so much family in Argentina and elsewhere. So that's, so technically, or at least methodologically, we've got a great product. We just don't know which Calabrese to use.
This is a great question. All right, cool. Yeah, let's talk about that.
Okay, cool. Thank you again for coming.
No, thank you. Thank you all. This has just been really wonderful. You're such a wonderful audience.
Thank you, Juliet. So we were very interested in knowing a little bit more about your next novel.
I would love to tell you. So I told you I wanted to write more about Calabria. Right around my book was bought to be published in 2017. And that's how long it took for it to come out. But in that time, I had sort of given up on anyone ever wanting to publish it, and I needed to move on. And in the course of this town of Taraci that I invented, right? I knew I wanted a ghost town somewhere near Jevoli. So I was Googling Calabria's ghost towns, and I came across the story of Africo. Do you guys know about Africo? So yeah, so
Yeah.
Professor Ganeri does, but
so let's see if what the students say. Okay, do you know about Africa?
Yes, because it is situated near my town.
Where are you from?
Marina di Gioiosa Ionica.
Amazing. Okay. So I became obsessed with the story of Africa. I will very briefly. It was depopulated in 1951. It was evacuated after a flood. It's deep in the Aspromonte Mountains, and it had been 3 years before, in 1948, it had been the topic of an article in a big magazine, L'Europeo, and basically creating an outrage platform. The journalist called it the poorest and most miserable village in Italy. And basically because it had been so neglected during the years of the 20s and 30s, it had no road, it had no doctor, it was 7 hours from the nearest town, there was no school, there was no food, people lived off of rotting lentil bread and acorns. I mean, it was painted a very dark picture of this place. So then there was a catastrophic flood. The village was destroyed and the population was moved down to the Marina, where they waited in refugee barracks basically for 13 years before a new comune was finally formed for them. And then in the 60s, they finally have a new comune. But in the meantime, half of the town has to emigrate and find somewhere else to live, or join the mob. So Giuseppe Morabito, who's capo di tutti capi of the 'Ndrangheta, is from Africo. So I think that's not a coincidence. So I became obsessed with this ghost town, and I started researching it. And the first thing I found was that I told you there was a catastrophic flood that destroyed the village. So supposedly that was the case. In fact, there were only 7 buildings that were destroyed. So it seemed to me very suspicious that the entire village was evacuated at this point. And I ended up connecting with a writer from Africo named Gioacchino Criaco, and his debut novel, Anime Nere, which I ended up becoming so obsessed with that we translated it and I published it at Soho Press, where I work. But and he's become a very good friend of mine. And so in 2017, I was in Calabria and I had this notion. I wanted to see Africo. I wanted to see this place that the people had been forced away from their paese, which created this cultural apocalypse. And I wanted to understand it. And so he took me there on a tour of the Aspromonte, and I was so struck by it. I learned that Africo is not the only town that was really not forced, but like very strongly encouraged to evacuate during those decades in the middle of the century. And in fact, now the Aspromonte Massif, it's basically empty. So many of these towns had their personality lost or forced away. And Africo was not part of Area Grecanica, but all the towns around it were. So you actually have this added linguistic and ethnic and sometimes religious minority question here. Why were Greco speakers forced away from their homes? Why were they forced to use Italian and to abandon their language and their culture? And so that's what I became obsessed with. Because I told you any idea that there's a story that can't be redeemed, that's lost forever, I have to dig my claws in. So I was like, I'm going to write about this. I'm going to write about the middle of the century in the Aspromonte and this phenomenon of people being forced to leave their houses. So the book is set in 1960. It's about a very idealistic American university girl, not unlike myself, who is she's living in the Aspromonte because she's working with an international charity to build nursery schools and an asilo in this town, right? The idea being that the town is so poor that maybe she can save lives if she can have hygiene and education for little children. And while she's there, there is a flood that washes away the post office, and it's an imaginary town named Santa Gionia. And so the post office is washed away, and underneath it is a skeleton. And so then it's set up like a mystery novel. She has to help some old ladies in the town figure out if the skeleton is their missing man, their missing son or husband or father. And in the process, she uncovers this history of transferment, and about the depopulation of the Aspromonte and Grecanico culture and stuff like that. So that's what I'm working on now. I'm almost done. My agent is reading it, so maybe if it's any good, it will be published in 2 or 3 or 10 years. These things take a long time.
Oh, thank you so much. It's really interesting. Do you mention the Festa di Polsi? Have you been there?
I've not been to Polsi. I was supposed to go to Polsi when I met you in December. I had a trip planned, and then the road ended up getting washed out because there was a rainstorm, which I thought was really apropos. But at the same time, I've talked to people. I made a friend during my research trip, a 95-year-old woman named Signora Maria, and she's a native Greco speaker, and she's from Bova Marina. She's amazing, and we chat on WhatsApp. So if I have a question, I'll be like, hey, did you eat chickpeas for breakfast in the 1930s? And she'll be like, this is how we cook the chickpeas. It's great. But she told me that when she was 11 years old, she walked from Bova Marina to Polsi and back because her parents had made a vow to the Madonna, if they saved her life, that she would do this. So it takes 3 hours to drive there over this terrible road, but it only takes 12 hours to walk. I think I need to walk to Polsi next time for the full experience. You want to come with me?
Yes, but I suggest during the festival is better.
Yeah, August.
Only once, and that was one of the strongest experiences in my life.
Yeah,
I swear. I mean, it's really, really something.
All right. So if we can get our vaccines, let's pencil that in for August 2021. We'll look at the festival.
So thank you very much. We finished our time, only 2 minutes left. But anyway, is there any of the students who would like to say something or ask a very, very extra fast question in Italiano? Just to conclude in Italiano. Ringraziando la nostra ospite.
Thank you all so much. This has been such a wonderful, wonderful meeting. Yes. And
thank you, Juliet. It's been fantastic, and I would like to thank you for your enthusiasm and passion for Calabria.
Oh no, spero che ci vediamo subito in Calabria.
Spero proprio di sì, e anche perché non vogliamo più questa pandemia terribile. Ma è molto bello quando si parla così, anche bene della Calabria, è molto incoraggiante, soprattutto adesso, con questa pandemia. La Calabria non è presentata molto bene ed è anche un po' difficile, no?
Ma anche America adesso.
Sì, è vero, è vero. È molto importante fare il lavoro che tu fai. What you do is so important. Outside literature, for literature it's really great, and also outside literature it's great. So I thank you very much for that. Grazie.
Se posso, volevo dire che è molto bello come molti americani, ad esempio come te, sanno moltissime cose in più di noi che abitiamo in Calabria. Magari anche molti colleghi o me stessa, quando si parlano di altre zone della Calabria, non conosco molte cose. È bello come tu sai più di noi non vivendo qui.
Oh no. Ma mi piacciono molto le cose calabresi. So.
Sì. I calabresi spesso non piacciono, e questo è il problema. Abbiamo bisogno di uno sguardo esterno che valorizza le cose che noi abbiamo, belle, e non capiamo. Vero che volevi dire questo, Giada?
Esatto.
Grazie mille Juliet. Grazie. Thank you.
Grazie a voi.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Grazie, salve.
Arrivederci.
Buona serata.
Arrivederci.